In this quiet residential area in Tokyo, this big passenger van stands out. Professional runner Yasunori Kusu uses it to shuttle his teammates back and forth from the practice track every day, but despite its usefulness, Kusu says American-made cars are impractical in Japan. They have poor fuel economy and take up a lot of space.
I got used to driving this large van, but I need to turn the wheel twice every time I make a turn because the roads are narrow and this car is huge. Also, when I do, the cars behind me make a line because they're not used to big cars like this. Designs are cool, but I don't think American cars will sell here.
The U.S.'s trade deficit with Japan rose to $69 billion last year, much of it because of the auto industry.
Many millions of cars are sold by Japan into the United States, whereas virtually no cars go from the United States into Japan.
Less than 1% of cars sold in Japan last year were U.S. brands. The majority of foreign-branded cars came from Europe, with 70% of all imported vehicles coming from Germany.
There's a lot of official dealers that sell European cars, but very few deal in American brands. When it comes to car shopping, American cars are big, so it's difficult for the Japanese to park them in their garages.
Size is particularly important to Japanese consumers. Nearly 40% of new cars sold in Japan are microcars. These tiny box cars are called K-cars. They're all under 1.5 meters wide, and the engine sizes are small too, at 660 cc or less. They're perfect to drive in Japan, where roads are narrow and parking lots are tight for space. Despite Tokyo having no tariffs on imported cars, the U.S. is considering a 25% auto levy. But the Japanese government says new U.S. tariffs could backfire on the U.S. economy and harm its job market. If the Trump administration wants to put more American cars on Japanese roads, reducing their size may be an easier way to reduce that trade gap. Mayu Yoshida, TRT World, Tokyo.
Dr. Seijiro Takeshita is the Dean at the School of Management and Information at the University of Shizuoka in Japan. He says the US and Japan must reach a mutual agreement soon to avoid any possible damage to Japan's automobile exports.
We keep talking about the economic measures, and of course, I think the Japanese agricultural side still needs opening up. So foreign pressure is actually a welcoming thing for the Japanese public, in my opinion, at least on the farming side. But to have an imposition of tariffs on cars, which consist of 30% of all our exports to the United States, is a very painstaking thing. And of course, to put a 25% taxation would be a devastating move for the Japanese. So obviously, I would say that the Japanese would have to come to a table to some kind of agreement. And this is becoming really difficult because until Mr. Trump, the agendas were usually talked beforehand, and usually when you have these talks, they would come to some kind of a conclusion. To make sure that the latter doesn't happen, I would say that they would have to basically abide or at least nudge to a certain degree on the domestic pressure. But that said, that's one thing the Japanese LDP, the current government, do not want to do because that's basically feeding a lot of vested interest and votes. And we are going to have an election next year, so obviously they really wouldn't want to take that option. What they would like to do is come to U.S. to some kind of a mutual agreement, which wouldn't be harsh and hurting the Japanese exporters, particularly the Japanese automobiles, because the accusation that's been given by the Trump and his regime, it just doesn't make sense, as has been the case with steel and aluminum and all others. So it's very difficult to argue with the delegates that are coming up with a very unreasonable factors in their negotiation.